From Washington, D.C. to the heart of America, welcome to Mark Alford's America. I'm freshman Congressman from Missouri, Mark Alford, and I believe in America. I believe in you, and most importantly, I believe our greatest days are still ahead. You know, each week we take you behind the scenes to share the stories, the news, the legislation, and most importantly, to meet the great folks I have the honor of working with each and every week here in Washington. Today, we're talking with Congressman Hal Rogers. He's the Dean of the House. Congressman Rogers has represented Kentucky's 5th District since 1981, serving 22 consecutive terms. In 2021, he became the longest-serving member of Congress from Kentucky. He was named the Dean of the U.S. House of Representatives in 2022. Dean Rogers was born in rural Kentucky, representing one of the poorest districts in the nation, but his vision for a stronger region spurred some of the greatest success stories, bringing local communities together through supporting small businesses, increasing tourism, and fighting the opioid epidemic. We'll get into that in our interview. With 40 years on the House Appropriations Committee, he has served on over 10 subcommittees, held leadership roles as chairman or ranking member of 6, including as the first chair of the Homeland Security Subcommittee in 2003. Right now, he's the chairman of the Commerce, Justice, Science Appropriations Subcommittee. A lot to get into today, and we are honored to be in his office in Rayburn House Office Building with a beautiful view of the Capitol. Dean, good to be in your office. This is the first time I've been in here.
Mark, I'm glad to see you. You're one of my favorite people.
Well,
and
thank you. I appreciate that.
Well, we share a lot of things together, experience, careers, and the like. But thanks for coming. I'm glad to have you.
Well, thank you. We're going to get into you have a radio background, and that fascinated me. The second half of this interview, we're going to talk about that. But what does it mean to be for those who don't know, what does it mean to be the Dean of the House?
It's a ceremonial title that is awarded to the longest-serving member of the House. So I've served longer than anybody else here.
What have you learned over those years?
Oh, what have I learned?
Yeah, what have you learned? What's like about how Congress operates?
The number one attribute that you must have is patience. There's 435 of us from every nook and cranny in the country, and it's hard to get anything that a majority of that number will support. So you got to have patience, and you got to have persistence.
You know, in a lot of districts, including mine, compromise is a dirty word. I prefer to use the word negotiate to get the best deal for our district, the best deal for Missouri. How have you been able to maneuver that throughout your time here on the Hill?
Well, I served as chairman of the Appropriations Committee for 6 years, and that's the committee that decides where we spend the money.
Right.
So it's a powerful place, but it's made up of 12 subcommittees, of which I'm now chairman of the Commerce, Justice, Science, NASA funding. So I've learned that you've got to look at the long picture. You've got to look beyond the horizon out there as we make our decisions about where we spend our money. So it's an important place, and it's one that I wouldn't trade for anything else.
Well, you know, we are in serious debt in America right now, almost $35 trillion. What do you think the solution is? I think, for one, is getting Trump back in office and getting this economy going again so we have more tax revenue coming in to help pay for it, to help rebuild the military and other programs that we so desperately need in America. What's your take?
Well, I think you're exactly right. The Trump years were tremendous. Tax cuts, a booming economy, strong national defense, bullying up where we need to around the world. But above all, we've got to discipline our spending. Now, here's an unknown fact. 2/3 of all of the federal spending we do, 2/3 of that is mandatory. That is to say, we have no choice, like Social Security, for example.
And Medicare.
Medicare, and others. So in order to cut spending, you've got some big places that you may not want to go.
And the American people don't, by the most part, don't want to go there either when we start talking about Social Security and Medicare. And typically the Democrats, the progressives, will gaslight the American people and say that the Republicans are trying to cut Social Security or cut Medicare. And that's not the case at all.
That's right. You got it right.
So where do we make those cuts? How do we get America back on track while, generating our economy that we're getting more tax revenue in without raising taxes on the middle class?
A booming economy lifts all boats. So I think if we can get the economy booming like it was under Trump, generating more revenue for the government, that helps us eat into the debt problem.
That's going to include cutting back on a lot of the overregulation that we're seeing right now through EPA, other agencies and bureaucrats that are basically trying to run Washington and usurping the authority that we have as members of Congress.
Yeah. And it was Reagan who, when he was president, who told us that if we increase taxes, it diminishes the economy. And contrarily, if we have a booming economy, we can afford to do things that we can't do now.
You knew Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
What type of man was he?
He was just like you saw him on TV. That's him. I mean, he was the same wherever it was.
Your face just lit up when I mentioned Ronald Reagan.
Oh, he's my favorite. Lord help us, we need him now.
What made Reagan different as a president? Because you've known how many presidents now in your career?
Well, back to Carter.
Back to Carter. What made him different than the other presidents we've had?
He was a tremendous communicator from his radio days. Mm-hmm. And he was honest, forthcoming, truthful. He was the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. I'll tell you a little story. When he led us to invade Grenada,
right,
to free up the students who we feared were being molested, his chief financial advisor told me this. He was his economic advisor. He said he was opposed to Reagan's invasion of Grenada. He said, I went in to see him after it was over in the Oval Office. And I told him, I said, Mr. President, why did you do this? I mean, there were Russian troops there. There were Cuban troops there. You could have sparked World War III by what you did. What was in your mind that made you want to do this? And he said, Reagan says, well, Artie, I asked myself, what would John Wayne do?
What would John Wayne do? I like that. It's so different now. The person we have in the White House, the current president, you and I saw firsthand the State of the Union just a few months ago, which I think was one of the worst states of the Union I have ever seen, to be yelled at for an hour. I felt like I had post-traumatic stress disorder after that speech. And I asked you, what was the best State of the Union address you've ever heard and the worst?
Well, I think Reagan certainly was the best. Every time he did the State of the Union, he improved even as he went along. The worst is the one that you just mentioned, of this sitting president who yelled at us and was argumentative and belligerent, and I thought was terrible.
But he came in promising to be the uniter of the American people. You were there. You saw the inauguration speech. What changed with this president? Why did he not fulfill that promise to the American people?
That's a good question, and I don't have the answer. But he has this experience on the Hill. He was in the Senate for a long, long time. And frankly, at that time, I thought he was fairly reasonable. But he has lost that.
We're going to be back in just a few minutes talking with the Dean of the House, Hal Rogers. I want to hear about your radio background. How did you get started? And you have one of the most interesting stories I've ever heard when it comes to broadcasting. It involves Khrushchev and Sputnik.
Yeah.
That story and much more when we come back. We're going to talk about the opioid epidemic, the fentanyl crisis, and what you're doing personally and in your office to combat that in the great state, Commonwealth of Kentucky, I should say. Let's not get that wrong. You're listening to Mark Alford's America. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Mark Alford's America, where we give you a behind-the-scenes look at Washington, D.C., and let you meet some of the folks helping shape our great nation. Today, we're talking with the Dean of the House, Congressman Hal Rogers of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Dean, good to be back in your office. You started out in radio. Tell me about that. What year was that, and how did you get into radio?
Well, I was a 16 or 17-year-old kid in Monticello, Kentucky. And the local radio station has a man on the street program. And that announcer asked me to help him with paperwork and so forth. But that's how I sort of got into the routine. So I finally got a full-time job at that station, worked there a year or two, went to college, didn't like it, went back to radio in Jackson, Tennessee, Dixie Radio, country music. And I'll tell you this, in those days, people would write letters in asking that you play a song for their husband or whatever.
Yeah, dedication song.
Yeah. And so I got this one letter, handwritten, says, "Dear Hal, H-O-W-L."
Howl at the moon.
Yeah. But anyway, then I went to Franklin, North Carolina, radio. And then to Somerset, Kentucky, where I now live, and then on to Lexington. And I worked in Lexington as I went to law school and undergrad. So, man, I love radio. It's the best way to communicate with people.
That's why it's so important that we preserve, particularly AM radio, I think.
Yeah, right.
It is a part of the fabric of America.
Yeah.
It gives news, information, resources, emergency alerts, especially in the rural areas that a lot of farmers, ranchers, and producers aren't going to get anywhere else. So I know we're working on that. I don't want to sidetrack with legislation. You interviewed some very interesting people in your career. Eleanor Roosevelt, the former First Lady, wife of FDR. Tell me about that.
Well, she spoke at a college in North Carolina near where I worked in the station. And so I traveled the 30 miles or so to where she was speaking at a college, and had a chance to interview her. She was gracious, she was tireless, and a wonderful person.
You told me a story a couple of months ago that really intrigued me about your covering the launch of Sputnik, which, for those who aren't familiar with Sputnik, was the first satellite launched into space in the 1960s by Russia. Tell me about that story.
Well, I was working in Franklin, North Carolina, WFSC, and I'd always been a great booster of rocketry and the like. So the Sputnik launch shook the world. It was a big event to orbit an object. So me and a buddy of mine at the station, we were like 18, 19 years old, decided we would make a story. We decided to call and record a conversation with Nikita Khrushchev, then the premier of the Soviet Union. So we turned the tape recorder on, made the call, no answer.
Hold on. How did you get the number for his office?
I don't recollect.
But somehow you were enterprising enough to get that number.
That's right.
And you actually called his office.
Called his office and the Kremlin. No answer. We called and called and called over days. No answer. Then we said, you know what? They may be on a different time zone from us.
Took you a few days to figure that one out.
Yeah, so we were calling like at 3 p.m. and it was like 3 a.m. over there or whatever. So finally we said, we've got this thing solved, and we called at a different time, like 3 a.m. And they answered, and we asked the lady what we had in mind was to record a conversation with the premier. Well, they said, well, sir, he's not available right now. But she did. I said, well, who else is there? And she said, well, the director of the Soviet International Inventory here or something. So we talked to this guy for an hour, hour and a half. Good conversation. We played that back then on the air, the tape. I don't think two people understood what we were...
But that was a big deal back then because the media wasn't as sophisticated as it is now to be able to reach around the globe to talk to officials, especially during the space race.
That's right. And that event, the launch of Sputnik, changed my life.
How so?
I was intrigued, so intrigued with it that I quit my job. Me and my wife moved back to Kentucky, and I enrolled in physics at the University of Kentucky because I wanted to be in the rocketry program.
Did you ever achieve that?
No, I did not.
But now you're on the Appropriations Committee, which funds NASA.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a fascinating thing to be a part of.
Where's the future of space? We are going to Mars eventually.
We're going to Mars. I think we're going to colonize the moon as a leapfrog toward Mars. But it's the wave of the future. It's economic, big time. We've got to maintain our leadership in space. We've got a great NASA and great leader of NASA, Bill Nelson, former senator,
right,
former House member.
But we've also joined private partnerships with Musk and others who are helping us get to this next level.
We've opened it up to private enterprise, not just the government doing it, but private companies who have talent, financing, longevity, and I think that's a big move on the part of NASA.
In our last couple of minutes, I want to talk about the opioid and fentanyl crisis facing America right now. We do fentanyl forums all over Missouri in our district because my contention is if this president is failing us and not going to close our border and leading to the deaths of over 100,000 citizens a year from fentanyl poisoning, we've got to do something about it. I know you're doing something about it in your district and the Commonwealth. Tell me about it.
We had a horrible problem 15 years ago. We were called the painkiller capital of America, which stirred me to start something big. We put together 33 counties in an effort to beat drugs because it was killing our young people. So we started a thing called UNITE, Unlawful Narcotics, Investigations, Treatment, and Law Enforcement. And that became so successful. We started chapters in every one of those counties of townspeople. And that was like 12 or 13 years ago. It worked so well, we decided to try to take it nationally. So we started a summit of people involved in the drug fight. We held that in Florida, and then successfully moving it to Atlanta, where it is now. And we'll have 4,000 or 5,000 people there, including all of the presidents back to Clinton, except the current president, who declined our invitation to attend. But it's the meeting of people like nurses and prosecutors and judges, politicians, senators, House members, and the like. And it's the only time that the entire industry is under one roof for 4 days. And it's been remarkably successful. We're continuing that effort. We'll have another summit. It's an annual summit. Have another summit meeting next April. And the fight now, as you have said, is fentanyl, which is terribly, terribly dangerous.
It's brutal. Dean, we're out of time. We've covered a lot of topics. I appreciate your friendship, your mentorship, and your service to our great nation.
Well, let me just tell you this. You're one of the outstanding members of this Congress.
Well, thank you.
You've moved so quickly.
That's because I've been hanging around you, learning all the secrets. Hey, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being with us. We'll talk again next week. Until then, remember, folks, I believe in you. I believe that our best days are still ahead of us. And Hal Rogers, I believe in America.